This conference will now be recorded.
Good evening, this is Mark Hobbin.
Good evening.
For those of you who have just joined us, we will start in just a couple of minutes. Make sure that everybody has an opportunity to log on.
All right.
I think we can start.
I agree.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Penny Gross, Mason District Supervisor, and I want to welcome you to this community meeting of Parking Reimagined. As you may see on the screen, this is about off-street parking and loading regulations under our various land use categories. This is not about the guy who lives next door parking his van in front of your house. This is about off-street parking, loading regulations, the kinds of things that the Board of Supervisors and staff have to take into consideration when we have land use applications. This is the beginning, is pretty much the beginning of a public engagement effort that will carry us through the end of next year. And so we will have a presentation from county staff, and then we will open it up for discussion. So if you have questions or comments, please jot them down so that you can participate in the discussion after the county staff has made their PowerPoint presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to our wonderful county staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Gross, and good evening, everyone. We want to speak to you today about how we're going to begin to reimagine parking in Fairfax County. My name is Michael Davis, and I'm the project manager for this parking effort. In addition to county staff with you tonight, we also have members of our consultant team who will be providing information for this project later in this presentation. Right now, I'm going to turn this over to Austin Gastrell for a few moments, who will discuss how to interact with and respond to this presentation tonight. Austin?
Yes, good evening. Please keep all mics muted and cameras off unless you're speaking. Mics may be muted or unmuted using the mic button in the middle of the screen. To participate or ask a question, please raise your hand using the hand button shown on the bottom left of the screen and staff will call on you. If you do not see the raise hand button, please use the meeting chat function to alert staff that you have a question and someone will call on you. If you do not wish to speak but have a question, just leave it in the chat and someone will address your question and we'll read it aloud. If you're joining via phone tonight and have a question, please make staff aware and someone will call on you. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our Parking Reimagined webpage. Lastly, a link to a 10-question exit survey regarding tonight's town hall will be shared at the end of the meeting. Participation in this survey is greatly appreciated and will help staff to better serve the community as a whole.
Thanks, Austin. Most people own one or more vehicles and take for granted that they will be able to park these vehicles in their travels. Most of the time, people don't generally think about parking unless they can't find a convenient spot or there's an unexpected number of vehicles parked near their home. Yet parking is everywhere around us. Most every land use in the county requires some parking. When people drive and park, they're focused on finding a convenient space. They don't often notice the gray empty edges that rarely have any vehicles parked there. A key purpose of this project is to have people think about parking a little differently, to begin to think of it as a resource. And when you do that, you begin to consider the importance of that resource relative to other important elements that we all care about, such as the environment, affordability, and land design. When parking has a community value, then you can think about how that value should be weighed against other initiatives. Parking is a land use, just like residences, office buildings, and shopping centers. This project intends to imagine how best to utilize that land resource. While the county is moving toward multimodal development that encourages more transportation options such as walking, biking, and transit, driving is and will remain a common activity. This, of course, will require us to park these vehicles. Therefore, providing parking with land use activities will still be necessary. This project recognizes that parking will continue to be supplied. However, it's important that parking be sized to the average demand for it. The term that was created for this is right-sizing parking, which is to not underbuild or overbuild parking supply for a land use. While we strive to right-size parking and requirements, we also know there are places and uses that present parking challenges. This project will take in that information and look for ways to address those areas. Here I'll provide background information on some elements of parking that hopefully gives some insight on the operation of and influences on parking and the role these play in considering changes to the requirements. Again, parking is a land use like your home, place of work, or where you shop. Parking has times of high and low demand. This can occur by the hour, day, month, or year. People know that during the holiday season, more people are out shopping, and this increases parking demand. In January and February, less people are shopping, and parking is freely available. While there can be times when it is difficult to find a parking space, parking should be constructed to address average demand. Within the county, there are places where you need a car for almost any activity beyond your home, and there are places where there are options that don't require a car. The character and location of site can influence parking demand. In urbanized and higher density transit-oriented areas, options that allow less reliance on a personal vehicle are available. It can even be possible to be car-free. This lowers the need for dedicated parking areas. Also, there are development areas known as mixed use that contain residences, places of work, shopping, and entertainment options. These types of combined uses can reduce the need for vehicle ownership for people who live and work there. Because the mixed use area has these closely located options, residents or employees can walk or bike. As one potential result, residents in these areas may decide to own only one vehicle instead of two, which reduces overall parking demand. Because parking is a resource, it can be operated to enhance its value. An example of this is shared parking. Rather than building the minimum required parking for an apartment building, an office building, and a retail center located on the same site, the demand for each of those uses can be studied and a smaller parking area can be built that provides enough parking for all these uses based on hourly demand. Looking now and toward the future, parking demand is changing with technology and people's behavior. Everyone's familiar with online ordering and home delivery of pretty much anything. This reduces parking demand when you don't have to go out to shop or eat. Also, even before COVID, remote working was growing annually. As we transition away from COVID, remote working is expected to continue to occur. These trends and other technologies to come will continue to influence the need for parking. Parking areas should be considered a resource to the entire community. It's land area that we have made a choice to use as parking. It could have been used for something else. When we consider the development of land, there are many elements that can be weighed, such as the environment, site design, and affordability. These are balanced with the need to provide parking, and sometimes the parking supply itself creates a need to address its effects, like stormwater runoff. Many times, the parking requirements for a site control how a site can be used. Questions we're asking with this project are the extent of parking's role in land use. How much parking do we really need? What are the trade-offs for less or more parking on a site? Where can we balance parking supply with other site use possibilities that will provide a community benefit? We want people to begin to think about priorities related to parking. Should a larger amount of convenient parking be the ideal? Or can we think about balancing car parking against other desirable features, like a quality urban streetscape that is inviting to safely walk and bike, or more open green space to enjoy cooling shade, or maybe provide something that is more interesting than this gray area? Every change has a consequence. If we are to look at a current problem with parking supply, how could we address it? Adding more parking is a solution, but what effects might that have? In any discussion, parking becomes part of a cost-benefit decision. What are the ideals we should be considering when making these decisions? Looking at the photo in this slide, if we wanted to add more parking to address the high demand depicted here, do we want to remove those trees in the background to add it? Or would having those trees be important enough to tolerate this amount of parking demand for a few hours a day? These are among the questions we would like you to think about as you listen to and view our presentation tonight. We hope you'll consider this when engaging us over the next 18 months as we reimagine parking. Community engagement is a critical element of this project. We're seeking meaningful feedback from all elements of the community, including tonight's participants, who have personal experiences and thoughts about parking. But the community also includes business owners and tenants, land developers, nonprofit organizations, and religious assembly groups. Our engagement on this project will include those folks as well. We have learned during the pandemic that we can reach more members of the community with our tech resources. Nearly everyone has access to a smartphone, and many are able to participate electronically, which has opened new doors for remote and mobile participation and feedback. Our project website will be a robust resource for information to allow the community to participate and monitor the project's progress. We also have more traditional technologies, such as cable channel 16, to use for communication. We will engage as many community members as possible during this project. The project will last about 12 to 18 months. During this time, we will gather community feedback in 2 distinct stages, but always be open to receiving info and discussion. The first step starts tonight with this town hall to present our project and begin to hear from you. The second will be when we take that feedback and develop proposals for your consideration. This will occur about halfway through the 18-month period. This project will focus on off-street parking and loading. We have 3 basic goals for this project: adding best practices and promising new ideas to operate parking now and in the future, increasing clarity and flexibility in the administrative language of the ordinance, which includes looking more at the context of a site or area to determine its parking needs, and streamlining parking review and approval, which includes increasing predictability of review processes, times, and outcomes. I'll now introduce Chris Fornash, who's with our consulting team of Nelson Nygaard. He will provide background on their important role in this project and the activities they will be working on to support it. Chris?
Thanks, Mike. As Mike mentioned, my name's Chris Fornash. I'm a principal at Nelson Nygaard in our Washington, D.C. office. We're a national transportation planning firm with 150 staff, all working on creating more sustainable, equitable, and efficient transportation in communities like those in Fairfax County. I've been working in this field for nearly 30 years, including for most of that on the role of parking in our communities. I also have insight into how development happens in our communities from chairing the Planning Commission in neighboring Arlington County a few years back. As Mike mentioned, our team is here to support staff in developing recommended code changes to bring before the Board of Supervisors, including Supervisor Gross, for consideration. The parking elements of the code in Fairfax County haven't received a systematic overhaul since 1988. That's not unusual, especially in fast-growing places that often don't have the time or take the pause to take that holistic look. Our communities were pretty different in 1988, as you no doubt realize. Consider just the impacts of the internet and how that has changed travel. The number of deliveries that you get compared to 1988, the availability of real-time transit information and how that might help you make decisions about how to travel, and many other systematic changes since 1988. Now, the changes to the code could include the wide range of things that Mike described, changes to minimum parking requirements, how shared parking is allowed and regulated, changes to loading and queuing. This work looks to the future, and Supervisor Gross mentioned this. This is about the rules for new development. This is not an effort to address specific deficiencies with existing development, although when we talk about parking, we inevitably will talk about those things, and we do want to hear about those things. But this effort is geared at zoning code changes, which is the forward-looking part of the county's operation. And as Mike articulated, new development and changes to how we allow new development connects directly to community values as expressed through the county's comprehensive plan, its newly adopted strategic plan, and other important documents and efforts. Efficient and varied transportation options that are sustainable and safe and accessible and affordable and equitable are pillars of all of those recent county documents. So along with our partners at Clarion Associates, Nelson Nygaard will undertake a number of activities in support of Parking Reimagined. The first step, which includes tonight, focuses on hearing from you in events like this and in other ways that you're hearing about from Mike. Now, in addition to supporting on community engagement, we at the consulting team are supporting and working on several other fronts. We understand how complex the development environment is in Fairfax County, from Tysons to Reston to Springfield to less dense, almost rural areas, diverse places that need carefully crafted rules and solutions. So to support that, we're gathering local data, mostly from pre-COVID 2019 and earlier, to understand the current parking supply and the parking demand and the impacts of parking on the environment and other outcomes. And at the same time, we're building an understanding of how other jurisdictions have modernized their parking requirements, some places near Fairfax County and others from around the country. And we're learning from recent experience in Fairfax how have recent development projects treated parking. That expresses how developers feel about the requirements and how they're working, and it reflects how citizens and staff and the board react to those proposals. We'll complement that understanding with an evaluation of transportation and development trends. We know that in the last 10 years, we've seen a diversity of new modes of transportation emerge. Uber and Lyft weren't around 10 years ago. Certainly micromobility modes like electric scooters and the one wheels and the other things you see people using in wider and wider contexts now didn't exist. And technology and other trends will continue to change transportation as we go forward. So what do we think it'll look like in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years? Not in an effort to predict the future, but to make sure the parking code does everything it can to accommodate and react to that changing future. And not just the distant future, but what does it look like coming out of the COVID period? What does a future look like where maybe the peak demand, especially for office, is not as high on a daily basis? We can all, or many of us, those who have white collar jobs and typically go to work 9 to 5, can imagine maybe not returning to the office the full 5 days a week for a while, maybe ever. So finally, we'll develop proposed changes to the zoning code and the administrative processes that go along with the code, working with staff to advance those to the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors for their consideration. And we will ensure that those recommendations connect to the community values that Mike described and I described as well. So let me hand it back to Mike to share with you what to expect going forward. Mike?
Thanks very much, Chris. We've begun the first steps in this project. As Chris summarized in his discussion, we have been getting feedback from other jurisdictions, both regionally and on the operation of their parking regulations and best practices. We intend to use this information to develop our proposals. Also, we began community town halls and more specific discussions with focus groups to gain background and perspectives on parking here at the county. As we proceed, we will continue to get critical input from all these sources of information and begin to develop proposed changes to the zoning ordinance. Once we have a proposal, then we will come back to the community to get their feedback on that. Then we will finalize our proposal for final consideration. We have a project website that will be continually updated with information and opportunities to participate in the Parking Reimagined project. I would like to remind you to complete the exit survey associated with this presentation, as it provides important background information for our project. I also remind you that this meeting is being recorded and will be available on the project website. We'll end our presentation with a few questions you might want to consider as you think about tonight's discussion. We hope this presentation helps you think about parking, or perhaps think about it in a different way. We encourage you to envision your perspective on parking and provide feedback to us, as it will help us define where we want to go for proposals to reimagine parking. I'll turn it over to Supervisor Gross to introduce the next stage of discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. We're now going to open the floor for discussion. But before we do that, perhaps one of our staff members can remind folks of the difference between the county piece and the state piece, because what we're talking about actually is on, it's mostly going to be on private property rather than on state right-of-way. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. The project is focused on parking areas associated with development. So it would be parking area with a multifamily building, parking area at your local grocery store, parking at your place of employment. It is not directly related to on-street parking. We are coordinating our County Department of Transportation on this project to make sure that some certain goals that we have are aligned. You know, for example, we don't want to, if we're making changes to the parking regulations, we don't want to create situations where there's, if parking is low on a site, that parking then spills over onto the local streets. So we want to try to make sure we achieve that balance, but our project is focused on off-street parking.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I wanted to also put something in context. I know we have, I'm pretty sure that Donna Jacobson from Lafayette Village is on, and there may be some others from homeowner associations that were built some time ago when we had, when families had fewer cars or fewer vehicles. And one of the things I hear from homeowner associations, those built a long time ago, and actually those built more recently, is that folks have more cars now. Rather than 2 cars in a family, you may have 4 unrelated people living in that townhouse, and there are, and each one has a car, and there are only 2 spots available for that house, and now you've got double that amount. So that can be a friction for the neighbors, and so as we move forward in looking at what we need to do for the future, we need to remember the current situation as probably a good cautionary tale that things do change over time. They can change rather quickly. You know, some places were built 30 or 40 years ago, or maybe 50 years ago. Others were built within the last 10 or 20 years, and they're still having the same problem. So just wanted to remind folks that if you think about that, sometimes it helps put what we're trying to do here in context. I think for discussion purposes now, since we really don't know, I'm not sure anybody, we have the little hand signal. So let's just go ahead. If you have a question or a comment, if you could simply identify yourself, where you live, your name and where you live, and then ask your question or make your comment. Would that work out with staff? We can
That would. That would. We also have a comment that's already in the chat from SC, and SC asked why we're using older pre-pandemic data to inform this this project, especially since that we've outlined how much uses and community behavior has changed in the last 2 years. So I'll let Mike and Chris answer that question on why we are using older data instead of current data right now.
Yeah, I'll start and then Chris can kind of join the conversation. But the timing of COVID relative to this project presents its own set of interesting circumstances. And one of the things that we were trying to capture is what transitions were occurring prior to COVID. And since we're not sure what's going to happen as a result of COVID long term, we wanted to at least try to understand what the trend line was for parking before COVID occurred. And there were some interesting trend lines that were already occurring as far as less parking demand, more remote working, more travel options that that are to continue. And certainly with the subject of remote working as an example, that is one subject that we're not real sure what's going to happen long term. Certainly over the next few years, there's going to be a lot more remote working, even after COVID passes for the most part and we kind of resume our normal lives. But there still could be a strong desire, both from business as well as people who are working for businesses to want to work remotely. But since we were uncertain about that trend and some other trends, we felt like a good baseline would be what was going on prior to COVID to have that analysis occur from that point.
Thank you. The next person who has a comment, anybody? This is questions, comments, additional information that you would like to have, maybe a particular issue in your neighborhood from the standpoint of what we're talking about here of off-street parking and loading. Loading is where you actually load so that you've got trucks coming into a shopping center. You may have somebody, a moving van in a homeowners association. It's just as it sounds, loading and unloading. Come on, we have county staff here ready to answer your questions, so please don't be shy.
Hi, Supervisor Gross.
Donna.
Yes.
I recognize your voice.
Okay, I couldn't find my raise hand button, but I actually have two questions, and one is, I personally am very interested in anything that could help with the environment, but I'm concerned. I know living in Virginia for the last 25 years, so many people are addicted to their cars and addicted to driving. How is one going to go about getting these people to change the way they think, even in mixed use communities? So many people still want to have their cars or a couple of cars in the family. How do we plan to go about changing how people think?
Wow, that's a good question. Staff, you want to take a stab at that? A lot of it is education and just the changing circumstances, and mostly reminding people that they're close, they can walk. We hear about that more people. We're seeing more pedestrians going to the grocery store and so forth these days. But yes, it's long ingrained in Americans to get in the car and go.
Yeah, and that's very true. I mean, America has been a very auto-centric society for pretty much since the auto was invented. But there are sort of behavioral changes that are occurring as people realize that they can live in a community that allows them to walk or bike or access things conveniently without using a vehicle, or perhaps even owning multiple vehicles. One of the thoughts that we've had, especially with like mixed use communities in more suburban areas, is that if there's a lot of convenient amenities available, people might think, well, I only really need one car to get to someplace that's out of this community. And then the other element to this is Uber and Lyft, and also car sharing, where people can, if they need a car or transportation for certain things, that they can use these ride sharing services and car sharing services to get to a destination that they would otherwise drive to, or for car sharing, if they need a car 1 or 2 days a week for some errands, that they can use that vehicle and then they don't have to own their own vehicle. So there are a lot of trends in that direction as far as people making choices. And particularly younger people are beginning to make those choices a little bit more frequently than those of us who are more used to having a car and driving around. So that's the component of that we're kind of trying to look at as far as trends. Sure, as Chris alluded to in his conversation. And Chris, if you have anything to add on that, please do.
Thanks, Mike. It's a really good question, right? Because we think about both how people's behavior reflects their values and their specific choices about how to travel, and we also think about the system we've built and what it actually allows people to do in a way that's safe and convenient. And you have to address both of those things. You have to provide real choices to people as a sort of necessary condition to getting people to consider doing something other than driving themselves everywhere. And that means safe biking networks and safe sidewalks. And it also means, as Mike said, mixing uses a little bit more so that there are more things that you can walk to that aren't just recreational, but actually fulfill your daily needs. I see Ellie's comment about making transit more cost effective and convenient. Absolutely. Transit, of course, relies on a certain level of density to be efficient, and is well supported by safe walking and safe biking to have access to transit, to high capacity transit in particular. But then aside from the sort of infrastructure side, or getting the transportation system to actually meet people's needs in ways other than having them drive their private vehicle everywhere, there are a lot of what the wonks in the business call demand management strategies. So what can you do to provide incentives to people to at least consider other ways to get around? And sometimes that's as simple as revealing the price of parking, because we all think about parking as being free, but it's not free. The land has a cost, even if it's an opportunity cost. The maintenance of a parking lot or a parking garage has a cost, and the cost is often not transparent to those of us who are traveling. We see time and time again when, think about multifamily residential buildings, when they separate out the cost of rent from the cost of renting a parking space, they see people's number of vehicles that they want to bring go down. It doesn't mean everybody who lives there doesn't have any vehicles, but it means on average you'll see more people choosing to live there with one car instead of two cars instead of three cars, and so on, and some who choose to live with no cars. Now, I don't have the immediate numbers at my fingers, but I'm going to guess that 10% or more of Fairfax County households already don't own a vehicle, and those folks predominantly lower income, some car-free by choice in Fairfax County, but I'm guessing the majority of those car-free by economic circumstance. They're getting around the county too, and a focus of county policy now is on equity, and equity in the mobility system means that you have to provide more economic choices than just every single adult has to have access to a car all the time. So a long answer to your short, but I think very good question about how does behavior change actually happen?
Thank you.
Yeah. And I had a second question, if I can ask it.
Go ahead, Donna.
And
Go ahead.
this is coming from my HOA perspective. If you have a community that might be close to a shopping mall or a small shopping center, and it's they're cutting down the number, not building as many parking spaces, how does one prevent additional street parking on the community streets at that point in time?
Well, there are a couple of options potentially. and it depends on the site in question and the circumstances of the neighborhood around the site. So the county has a residential permanent parking district program that is well established, and there are many parking districts in the county. So there are obviously qualifications that would go into that, but that is an option potentially if the spillover parking impacts the residential neighborhood. There are other potential parking restrictions that are available, based on safety, based on demand, but those things are administered by the County Department of Transportation. It's not really a focus of our project. It could be, and that was one of the things that I tried to point out a little bit earlier is, we're trying to achieve this balance of many factors. And one of the balances that we're trying to achieve is to not create situations where we're encouraging such a low parking supply that the immediate effect is going to be spillover parking on the local street network. So, so we will have to be cautious of that as we consider what changes we might make to parking, but there is also an ability to remedy that on-street problem, and there could be other remedies that come in the future as the Fairfax County Department of Transportation continues to study on-street parking and ways to manage it.
Thank you. Donna, does that do it for your questions?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go.
We do have 3 people on the phone, which I'm going to unmute. So if you're on the phone and you have a question, just say your name and then we'll recognize you. So just 1 second.
Go ahead with questions.
I'm just trying to unmute them right now. Just a minute. Austin, you know how to do it? I can mute him by unmuting him for some reason.
Yeah, so anyone that's on the phone, if you have the unmute button that's going to be, right next to your regular tone, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Please be sure to identify yourself also. Thank you.
Correct.
Go ahead. Anybody there with a question? All right, since we have some more questions in the chat. One from SC, how are you approaching how Parking Reimagined can help the county meet its own carbon emission goals? Good question. Staff?
Well, one way to consider the relationship of parking and the carbon emissions concerns is in the sense of one of the things with parking, Chris talked about that parking really isn't free. And one of the elements that can be considered with this project revolves around induced parking, in the sense that if it's kind of the situation that the phrase that people have heard in the past of, if you build it, they will come. And if you create situations where you are building an ample amount of freely available parking without any sort of fees associated with that, it's going to be very convenient for people to just say, I'm just going to drive there and park because I know I'll get a space. So part of the approach to right sizing parking is making it more of a choice to go and park. A lot of times when people go to higher density areas like downtown DC, they will choose, I'm going to Uber to DC, or I'm going to take Metro to DC, because it's a little bit more of a challenge to find a parking space in those areas. So we can also kind of apply those principles as part of our consideration of parking in this project, of more to a choice of whether you're going to drive or use an alternative to driving or to parking. The other elements of that is the communities that we're designing. A lot of the focus of development in Fairfax County is to try to be transit oriented. The higher density development areas in Fairfax County are in the transit station areas. And so that gives people the option to use transit to get to their place of work or to other entertainment options, to hop between stations, as an example. And also, when you have high density development, you give people to use other options that don't involve a vehicle. So that also can have an effect on reducing carbon emissions and helping the county reach those goals.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments? Here's a question in the chat from Ellie. If free parking is not readily available, a lot of people simply choose not to go to those areas, such as Boston or Georgetown. That's probably right. You have to think ahead. And some people decide not to do that. And then many do. They're not, those are not hurting. But also there is, for Boston, there's certainly some decent transportation, mass transportation. And Georgetown, I think, has a lot of people who come by, who walk to those areas. But yes, sometimes that's a choice that people can make.
Well, and I think that's an important point that Ellie had made, is that, and it gets back to the conversation about choice and also neighborhood design, because there are communities that are designed that attract, people can decide whether they want to go to these communities for entertainment options, dining, or residence. And those who are constructing the communities, it becomes sort of a mechanism, a self-fulfilling mechanism, if you will, of trying to create these high density communities that are multimodal in nature and give options for people. And there are some people that want to be in those communities and really thrive there. And there are people that have chosen to live in areas that are lower density. And so that gets into the dynamic of choices and values that we are exploring with this project.
Thank you. Who has the next question? Anybody have another question? Or a comment? Open to comments too. Go ahead.
Penny, I'd like to contribute something.
And who is this?
This is Mark, MKH.
Go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
First of all, the call-in, I was one of the 3 participants with the call-in. We cannot contribute by voice. I don't know if it's the situation with the software, but what your consultants might be able to contribute with regard to parking densities, as well as what has been said already, parking is not free. And as Penny, you know perfectly well with Wynwood Drive right now, is that we have a condition where there are multiple vehicles being parked on Wynwood Drive which are destroying as well as discharging and dumping fluids onto the public right of way. And as you might know directly, Penny, is that there is a commercial carpet company being operated out of 4108.
Okay, well, Mark, I need to stop you right there, because this discussion actually is for Parking Reimagined, as I said at the outset, is not about parking on the public right of way in a neighborhood where somebody else is parking. A neighbor is parking where perhaps neighbors don't want them to park. This is very definitely the Parking Reimagined study is for the off-street parking and loading requirements that go along with our zoning ordinance and our land use applications. Now, I think that in some cases, as I said about Lafayette Village and other HOAs, that in neighborhoods that have single-family detached homes, sometimes have the same difficulty with more people with vehicles living there, which creates a problem for some of the neighbors because there are cars parked on the street. When the community was first built, cars were parked in the driveway. They were not parked on the street. And so we have that kind of a situation in many neighborhoods. But this particular discussion is really focused on off-street parking and loading regulations. So I'd like to go to, thank you for your input, Mark, but I think we need to continue the focus on the purpose of this particular discussion. Thank you. Anyone else?
There's a question in the chat about transit routes near East Falls Church. And
Elaine has parking at East Falls Church Metro is limited. Any plans for adding more transit routes that pass near East Falls Church Station?
Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question, but the Fairfax County Department of Transportation, their Transit Operations Division, may be able to provide you more information on what future plans there are for transit in that area and to East Falls Church. So you might want to speak with them to see what information they might have.
Well, this is Penny Groves. Let me add to that. I know that as we're looking at, could someone please mute themselves? As we are looking at bus rapid transit along Route 7, along Leesburg Pike, that includes the City of Falls Church. And I know they very much want the bus rapid transit to make a turn and go up to East Falls Church so that you've got more transit getting to East Falls Church. Now, whether that's doable or not is a question we don't have the answer for, but there definitely is, there have been conversations about how to make East Falls Church a little more usable by more people, so that transit would go there. No answers at this particular point, but it has not been overlooked, I will tell you that. And we have a couple of other comments in the chat. Do we have any more questions? We do have a note in the chat from our Nelson Nygaard consultant. Pre-COVID, WMATA in Fairfax County and Arlington County were adding to bus service into the East Falls Church. And yes, East Falls Church Station, I believe, actually is in Arlington County. It's right on the line. Question from Yolanda, are these slides available in Spanish? And will there be future opportunities for multilingual community engagement? That's an answer for staff. I would imagine that we can arrange to have the slides in Spanish, and as we do continued community outreach, we need to keep in mind that there would be multilingual opportunities, both Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, Urdu, Farsi. The county is committed to providing additional languages. We do have to do some advanced work to make sure that we have the right people to do the translation.
And to Yolanda's point in the comments, absolutely, it's something that I'm personally working on right now. And we will be for future meetings. We can use a software that we have called Public Input. It's a mirroring software that actually translates the meetings as a whole. Further, our webpage is all translatable, and we will have slides available on there. and anything by demand in different languages we can get translated, no problem. And especially if we know that we're going to a meeting with primarily Spanish speakers, we can have a live in-person translator as well if need be. So I really appreciate your comment, and it is something that we're working on and do have that availability if need be.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions? You know, that on the slide right now, the bottom bullet, how do you think travel options and preferences will change in the next 20 years? Anybody have any thoughts on that? If we look at the last 20 years, it's still very, very car-centric, vehicle-centric. But we have more and more people who want to bicycle. And anybody have any thoughts about how those preferences might change in the next 20 years? What the next generation of young people might want? You can always put it in the chat or get in touch with staff after on the website afterwards. There also was another question in the chat. Would areas that don't have mass transit like Mason District allow for more parking than areas near Metro?
That is one of the things that we are looking at with the project. The county currently has reduced parking requirements near transit station areas and in Tyson's in the Tyson's core area. So there are those opportunities that are there today. There are some potential modifications we would make, particularly to the TSA areas, to provide a little bit more flexibility in establishing parking. So, but the overall approach is to be mindful that the county has a lot of stratification as far as neighborhoods, high density, low density areas. And so the goal of the project is to be more contextual in our approach to parking, not get away from the sort of one size fits all approach the parking regulations have today.
If I may add, we may not have any metro stations in Mason District, but we do have rather robust bus service, which also is mass transit. One of the challenges we have for mass transit is that people who live in neighborhoods and live too far to walk to a bus stop, often they'll drive and then try and find a parking place near the bus stop. They'll park at the library parking lot on Little River Turnpike, or they'll park in neighborhoods and folks don't particularly like the cars parked there all day. That is a challenge for us in trying to make sure that people understand that in some cases they can park in certain places and other times they can't. Certainly you can park legally on a public right of way without any problem, unless it is prohibited by law or by signage for instance, like residential permit parking districts. But one of the challenges I think we really need to look at, and this may be for staff, some of our facilities that have private parking, park off-street parking, the library, a shopping center, how you do shared parking arrangements so that the bus riders can park their cars without fear of having them towed. That is we want to encourage folks to get off the road and take the bus, but in many cases, quite frankly, realistically, they need some place to leave their vehicle because they live too far from the bus stop, but they don't want to drive all the way to work. So that's something that we might want to keep in mind as we're looking at parking. Anyone else have anything that they want to offer as a comment or as a question?
Yeah, we've got a couple different comments that are in the chat here. SC mentioned that in order to get people out of their cars, the trail and pedestrian system has to be fully built out and needs to reflect updated patterns of use. Again, we're looking at kind of off-street parking and loading requirements, but I don't know if Supervisor Gross, do you want to touch on that?
I'm sorry, I was looking at the chat. I wasn't. Would you
Yeah,
say
I was
that?
talking about Essie's comment about to get people out of their cars, the trails and pedestrian systems have to be fully built out and need to reflect updated patterns of use. And I was saying that it's while trails and those pedestrian systems aren't per se part of our amendment and our project here, I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on that, Supervisor Gross, about the Mason District and trail planning
Sure.
within the Mason District.
Yes. Actually, we have an active transportation plan in the county, and trails certainly can be put on that plan. One of the things we're going to be doing very shortly, I just had a meeting yesterday about the proposed Annandale Greenway, which takes folks from Green Spring Gardens and the eastern part of Mason District all the way to Annandale Community Park in the western part, and uses in almost every case except for about 3 places existing sidewalks and trails. It's a great idea. It's about 4 miles worth of trail, and it essentially goes right down through the middle of Annandale. But it uses park trails, and some of the conversations we've been having with Park Authority is to make those trails, make sure that they're maintained properly. The question sometimes is, what kind of surface? Are you going to have stone dust surface, concrete, asphalt, or just a natural surface? Depends on who your users are. But yes, trails and sidewalks are a big deal in Mason District, especially. We've done quite a few of them over the last 25 years. You can walk to places you never could walk to before safely. And we also have a sidewalk project for Sleepy Hollow Road from Columbia Pike all the way down to Seven Corners. So the work is ongoing, and people want more and more opportunities to walk. They need to have a safe place to walk, and that's what we're working on, both with the Fairfax County Department of Transportation, with Chris Wells, the pedestrian staff, and also with the Park Authority.
Great. So Donna in the chat as well asked, what factors come into play when determining the right sizing of parking spaces for new development? It's a great question. Mike or Chris, do you want to take a stab at that?
I'll go first, and then Chris can add whatever thoughts he might have on the subject. But one of the things is, as far as right sizing is concerned and how we would approach that, is we have technical information available to us from a variety of sources that give us average demand for parking for various uses. And we can use that information to see what the demand characteristics are for a particular use or a group of uses, and be able to design the parking to be able to address those circumstances, as well as looking at, are there certain peak times of the day, week, month, year where you might need some additional parking, and what sort of facilities are you going to have available for that? There are a couple of ways of looking at that. Potentially, one would be if you have multiple uses on a site, you might be able to share parking amongst those uses. Each uses may have different peak demand characteristics that you can kind of work around to create a parking supply that would be consistently available for all of the uses and kind of spread out the peaks within that parking area. So that's one approach that you could use for right sizing. There are a number of other different approaches to be considered as you look at trying to provide the optimal parking for a particular site. And Chris, if you have any further thoughts on that, please share those.
Yeah, it's a good general question, and it's a core part of this study, right? That is, as Mike characterized, right? There's the location of development with respect to other activities, with respect to transit and other ways to get around. There's the density of the development. There's a specific mix of uses, excuse me, and then there's is the parking going to be priced? Are there going to be other economic incentives, et cetera? So, so there are physical characteristics that come into play when figuring out the right amount of parking, and then there are, non-physical characteristics like price, et cetera. And then factored into all that is, ongoing trends. And someone asked at the very top of this, right? Why would we be using 2019 data instead of COVID era data? When what we can say about both is that they probably don't represent what the study or what the system will look like in 2 years, right? That there will be somewhere between probably what we saw in 2019 and what we see now, although, as Mike said, continuing some of the trends we saw pre-COVID. So those are all factors that go into exactly what we're trying to get out of this, which is a set of parking requirements and development rules that are more appropriate and more responsive to those sorts of changes.
We do have a question.
Since I have the mic up, and I'm sorry to step on you, Supervisor Gross, the MKH had a question about last mile transportation and especially electric scooters, et cetera. MKH is absolutely right that DDOT recently changed their rules to require that those personal scale micromobility devices need to be locked to something in DC under those new regulations. But I'll just note that, 4 years ago, we didn't see any of those things, and we're all experiencing a learning curve, and that's the people who use and ride those, the people who use sidewalks and other transportation and aren't used to seeing those things around, the jurisdictions and how they regulate those new modes of transportation. So we're all sort of learning together, and we've certainly seen it start to get, let's say, the social rules around them start to get better observed over the last couple of years, and we expect that to continue.
And I agree with MKH, absolutely. Every time I drive through the city of Fairfax, I see those all over the place. And sometimes they're in nice vertical lines, and often they are just thrown aside, and they're blocking the sidewalks and so forth. The contracts with the companies actually address some of that, but it's very difficult to enforce. I think we're going to see more we're going to see stricter rules perhaps as we look at future contracts or future approvals of the uses of those various devices. Elaine H1 is asked, where do people want to walk on Sleepy Hollow Road? The East Falls Church Metro is too far away. Elaine, people want to walk for recreation, just up and down. There are 2 pools along Sleepy Hollow Road that are well subscribed, and folks want to be able to walk to the pool rather than drive to the pool. I know a lot of people who walk to Seven Corners to do some shopping, and so there is a lot of desire to be able to walk on Sleepy Hollow Road. It's not necessarily a transit issue to the metro. It's really to do things more locally. And we have a question from Blanca Castro in Spanish, and if I am looking at it correctly, I am not good at Spanish necessarily from high school, but I believe the question is perhaps about parking at the library at Woodrow Wilson. Is that the gist of it, Blanca? If I am interpreting this properly, in the Colmore area of Mason District, there are a lot of those apartment complexes were built so long ago that most people actually didn't have cars because it was built back in the late 40s and early 50s. And so now everyone has a car, and there aren't enough, the parking lots in the apartment complexes are not nearly large enough to handle the number of people who want to park there. And street parking is very, is tight. So more recently, people have been parking at the Woodrow Wilson Library parking lot. on parking overnight and using it as their own personal parking lot. We've put up gates because parking at the library after hours is not permitted. The parking is provided for the library patrons, for the folks who are accessing the park there, and for the people who are accessing the soccer field there, not for folks who live in the neighborhood just to be able to park. It is a problem for folks, I know, but we also have a responsibility to keep the county parking available for the folks who are accessing the county facilities. Donna Jacobson, good question. Are charging stations for electric cars going to be incorporated into new parking areas? There was a question earlier about meeting our carbon goals, and in many cases, in fact, I can't think of a large land use case recently that didn't include charging stations. We actually changed our ordinance to allow charging stations in already built shopping centers, and made it much easier for the owners to put in charging stations. We also used, I believe it was some of the Volkswagen settlement money to put charging stations in some locations. I know at the Annandale Shopping Center right there on Columbia Pike just put in 2 charging stations. The giant grocery store in Annandale also has 2 or maybe 4, I don't remember. But charging stations are the idea of a charging station is very popular these days. And most of our land use applications do incorporate an opportunity for charging stations. I don't know if staff wants to add to that.
This is Bill Mann. Yeah, charging stations are permitted as an accessory use in residential development, commercial development, so they can go in. And with the recent change with ZMod, we used to not count charging stations as a parking space. Now they do count. So if you put in a charging station, it counts as a regular parking space would. So there's no disincentive to put in charging spaces as there may have been before. So that's something we certainly encourage, modify the ordinance to help encourage that type of use.
Thank you.
And one thing I wanted to say.
Okay, go ahead.
One thing I want to say to Blanca's comment, I'm putting in the chat the webpage to Fairfax County Department of Transportation. They're working on street parking issues. She had mentioned that her husband had been getting tickets for parking on the street. I would suggest looking into Fairfax County Department of Transportation and what they're doing right now about on-street parking and their study with on-street parking.
Thank you. Part of the problem, and I'm glad that my high school Spanish got a little bit of the gist of Blanca's question. The challenge, I think, for the Colmore area is that much of the area is a residential permit parking district. It qualified years ago for that. And so if you do not have the appropriate sticker, then you will get a ticket. And that has created some challenges. Absolutely. I understand that.
And if I can just throw out one of the new ideas that some other parts of the country have developed over the last few years is an evolution of the residential parking permit district to, especially in places I'm reasonably familiar with Colmore, where there's ample on-street space, that a parking permit district can evolve to actually allow people to pay a fee to park on the curb within that district, and the proceeds from those fees can go into, specific neighborhood transportation improvements. That's been used a number of places in the West, and not suggesting it's the solution here, but when you have that desire to park in a neighborhood and the neighborhood has the tool already in place to regulate it, that it can get beyond the regulation of you can or you can't to, okay, you can if you pay. And there's an evolution of tools like that.
Thank you. We have about 20 minutes left in our announced time. If anybody has additional questions or comments, ideas, suggestions.
As we mentioned earlier, there is a survey Austin just posted in the chat, as well as earlier, and maybe Austin posted in, we have our link to our webpage where any additional meetings in the future will be posted there, as well as information that we want to send out to people. And you can also sign up for a listserv. So we'll drop in there our webpage for this for people if they want to click on it, and they can get future information.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Our webpage is being updated continuously. And what I would say, that public input survey, the link I just put in there, there is a couple questions there. And if you need to translate it as well, there's a translate option at the top. You can translate it into whatever language it needs to be translated to. And with that, there's a comment box at the bottom. If you have any other questions that maybe even after the meeting tonight that you think of, feel free to click on that and to drop your comments there or on our email address, which is on our website too.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else? Here's a comment from SC. Presumably, right sizing could mean more parking in places, or do you expect, based on the data, that parking will be reduced? If it is reduced, generally, what is likely to be done with those areas? Density, parks?
Well, I think that question and comment kind of summarizes what we are looking to achieve with the project, as far as what kind of trade-offs will we consider if we have less parking. And the point is well taken that conceivably right sizing could mean more parking, depending on the situation that we have with evaluating our uses and parking requirements. There could be changes to the minimum requirement that might actually require more parking based on experience we've had in the county and national experience, local and national experience. But a lot of times there are situations where you go to a site and you have a large parking area, and a lot of that parking area is unused for most of the time. And so from that point of view, if there are opportunities to use that parking area for something else, and that could be more open space, it could be more site amenities, it could be another building or opportunity for affordable housing or something of that nature. I mean, one example that we have that we're working on right now is the Fairfax County Government Center. There was a lot of parking built with that project. And for those of you who have gone to the Government Center, you probably see that firsthand. But what we're doing is we're taking part of that parking area and repurposing it for affordable housing. The type of opportunities that could come about as we look at the parking requirements and development opportunities moving forward within the county.
Thank you, but I want to make sure that folks understand that's a proposal. It has not been actually done yet. It's under consideration, and the board has not acted on it other than to put it forth as as something to study with our redevelopment housing authority. I don't want anybody to think that we've got apartments on the government center parking lot yet.
My apologies. My apologies for jumping the gun.
But there's one thing that just occurred to me, actually from the right sizing question, and something that has happened more recently to accommodate parking in new townhouse communities. The Planning Commission has been quite active in addressing the size of a garage in townhouses that have garages. Now, this is on private property. It's an HOA. And because of the desire by some builders to gain more density, the parking is going to be, one of the parking places would be in the garage, and one of the parking places would be on the parking pad outside. And so one of the things we're finding is that the parking can be so tight in the garage of the house that an SUV might not fit that garage. That's a caution for any homeowners who may be trying to either change vehicles or buy a new house and have an SUV. It's something that was discovered after the Planning Commission had already taken action. I know I have a townhouse development in Mason District that is finding this to be almost an oops, because it is going to control the size of the vehicle that you can park in the garage. Ellie has, as you might or might not be aware, we have a conflict here in Mason District about the school system's attempt to build a parking lot on Justice Park to accommodate the renovation of Justice High School. Could the zoning ordinance be revised to prohibit the reduction of parkland for parking lots using parkland for, I don't see the rest of that. Well, first of all, Ellie, as you know, the school system's proposal to add parking on Justice Park is dead. That is gone. It is dead. It is not coming back. And the school system is looking at rezoning. They will be filing a rezoning application, which would on the Justice High School site, which would address some of the parking requirements. So I don't want anybody on the call to get to have the misunderstanding that there's going to be parking at Justice Park. There is not going to be parking for Justice High School at Justice Park. And I think the zoning ordinance, could the zoning ordinance be revised to prohibit the reduction of parkland for parking lots? Be careful there, because much of our parkland also has a need for parking lots for the people who are accessing those parks. So be careful with that, sort of broad brush. I think that you do not want to restrict park visitors from having a place to park at a park when they're visiting. Is there anyone else? You can put your comment in the chat, or you can ask it by voice. We have about 12 minutes left, and I'm going to ask staff, in previous meetings, have you adjourned early because of no more questions and comments, or do we keep the lines open until 8:30?
We can adjourn early if need be. We've done that previously in our meetings. But what I would just ask is that, again, as I mentioned in the chat, I've got links to our Parking Reimagined webpage and the survey. So as I already mentioned, if you got questions that maybe didn't come up or something that you would like to add, please feel free to use that survey option or our webpage to connect with us. And I would also say is that be on the lookout for future opportunities to engage with us on this project. We will be coming back after we've kind of determined some ideas of what we may want to do with this project in the sense of amendment language, and coming back to the public for consideration and feedback. So those opportunities will be posted on our webpage and also on different social medias. I know that tonight's meeting was shared on the Mason District Facebook page, as well as our Facebook page for the Department of Planning and Development. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I will hand it back over to Supervisor Gross.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a nice attendance, some very good questions. All the questions and comments have been captured by our staff, as well as we have had the entire meeting recorded. And that Staff, please tell us how that recording may be used. Is that going to be used internally for you to capture what you, what might be, you know, something, what did they say? Or is that going to be available for public use? I'm not sure how you use this.
Both. So both. It's something that all of our meetings, such as our town halls, are being recorded and posted on our website. So if you go on our website right now, it says, you know, upcoming meetings, and it has the Mason District on there. Tomorrow it'll be moved to a previous meeting, and then it'll have the actual video of our meeting tonight. Staff is also using that to all these meetings and recording them for a way to go back and to record comments or to you know, to hear comments that maybe we want to readdress and see how were they asked and what was the context. It's just a resource for us to better understand what comments the community had and how we can better address them.
Thank you. And I do want to mention that the next two meetings for Parking Reimagined for two different districts, the Providence District Virtual Town Hall will be Monday, the 22nd of November at 7. And that will, of course, probably include a lot of discussion about Mosaic and Tyson's, because both of those locations are in Providence. And then the Drainsville District Virtual Town Meeting will be on Tuesday, November 30th. That's after Thanksgiving, also from 7 to 8:30. So if you want to listen in on other district discussions or have friends in those areas, or maybe you travel to Tyson's a lot, you might want to log on to those. So with that, thank you, everyone. They'll be keeping posted as we go through this over the next several months. And I want to thank county staff for helping out here today. And everyone, please have a lovely evening and happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
You as
Thank
well.
you very much.
Thank you.